So I'm going to start off. We have three outstanding panelists. The intent of this session is to consider how over the course of 120 years that the spirit of the agency has not only endured, but in many cases, during difficult and trying times, it's actually excelled. And the agency's been leaders in so many things regarding conservation and our public lands. The idea of conservation commitment, the greatest good in the long run, the pride in the history, the spirit of the outfit have been amazing. And it's hoped that this panel will be able to provide you an opportunity to reflect a little bit, to maybe a dose of realism, and even some optimism in what perhaps is one of the most challenging times that this agency has experienced. So the panel, I'm going to operate kind of in a dual role. I'm going to take the role of panelists to start with for a few moments, and then we have three other panelists who are going to make presentations, and we'll take some questions and maybe make a few closing thoughts at the end. The panelists that we have today are Donna Sinclair, James Skillen, and Rachel Klein. They're all historians of different types. They come from different places and they have different specialties. Donna teaches history at Washington State University in Vancouver and Western Oregon University. She's an author, an oral historian, and a public history professional who's written extensively for the Park Service and collaborated with the Forest Service. Her work addresses a number of issues and opportunities to enlighten the public. And you can see on the screen some of the works that she's done. The second panelist is James Skillen. He teaches geology and geography and environmental studies at Calvin College in Michigan. He has a PhD in policy, natural resource policy from Cornell University, and he writes primarily about the history of public lands in the American West. He teaches field courses on public lands in California, Oregon, and Arizona, and he's finishing an introduction to the federal public lands book with law professor Bruce Hoover. And you can see some of the books that he's written. The third panelist is Rachel Klein. Rachel is a second generation Forest Service employee. Her grandfather served in the agency. She spent 16 years as a Forest Service historian, leading projects that documented agency heritage and established a national history program. She now serves as a principal cultural resource team lead for SWCA Environmental Consultants in Phoenix, where she continues to connect history with present-day conservation work. She's writing a couple books, and all three of these are just outstanding folks who bring a different perspective than perhaps many of us have of history. So, how are we going to do this? For me, I'm going to start off by giving an overview of 12 decades. 12 decades, starting in about 1900. I'm going to do this fairly swiftly, at least for me it's fairly swiftly, you probably say differently. But it's all to kind of refresh our memories and to reflect a little bit about what everything has happened to this agency since Gifford Mitchell started. And a few of you will see a few slides in here that you may have seen 20 years ago, but I'm guaranteeing you haven't seen my slide for the last decade, maybe the last 2 decades. So it's changed just like history does. It changes, and what was happening today ends up being history for tomorrow. So there's no better place to start than the beginning when you're taking on something like this. And so let's look at how fortunate we are, those of us who love the public lands, who work our careers in public lands, to think about the generational legacy of the late part, 1860, 70, 80, 90, and the fact that we ended up with the forest reserves. And all of these folks, plus many more, had this same burning inside them that we have. And that was about these lands are more valuable than we are treating them, and we need to take care of them differently than what we have been up to that time. So that 1890, 1899 was kind of set the stage for the United States Forest Service. Pinchot was fighting like crazy to try to create an agency in the Department of Agriculture under the Division of Forestry. And he needed some things to happen, and they did. And 1900, you have Pinchot finally having a friendly figure in the White House, and he and Teddy figured out a way to create the agency that Pinchot had dreamed of for so many years. In 1900, he started the Society of American Foresters, and in January of 1905, we had a Forest Congress, and that was the thing that brought the transfer. Of course, the use book, many issues of that decade. And as I go through these slides, I'm going to focus mostly on the yellow writing at the top. So it was Pinchot's Forest Service, the use book, a lot of battles about grazing in particular, and the idea that if you're going to manage resources, you've got to have science, you've got to have research, you have to know what you're doing. So those are things that happen. 1910, 1919, for Pinchot, started off by your fire. And that was a pretty significant event for the agency. We all know that there was a lot of folks that thought that was the end of the Forest Service. The Big Burn, the Weeks Act, 1903, World War I, Spanish flu, 2 new chiefs. Greeley became chief towards the end of that period of time. 1920 to 1929, some new folks thinking about some different things. Maybe there ought to be a recreation program in the Forest Service. And Carhart worked hard to make that happen. He asked for some money for recreation, and that was denied, and he left the agency. But ultimately, recreation started to become part of the agency. Wilderness, obviously, Leopold in 1923. But probably the most significant thing coming out of that decade happened with the crash of '29, which set up the Depression, which came also the Dust Bowl, the CCCs, the WPA, 10 a.m. policy, Wilderness Society is established, Tillamook Fire, Griffin Fire. All through all of these slides, there's a thread of fire on every single decade. World War II, did I skip a decade? Oh, I did. World War II, 1940, Smoky Bear, baby boom, housing crisis, need houses. Truman signs the Housing Act in 1949, Man Gulch Fire. They passed the House Joint Resolution 205 in that year, which allowed for the export of logs from Alaska, which became the 50-year sales after that. 1950, get the cutout, build roads, build dams, busy development. Everything has an answer, you just got to develop it and do what you can. It's also the birth of most of the ski areas in the country during that period of time, even though we had some 20 years earlier. It really didn't blossom until the 1950s and 60s. 1960, Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act, Wilderness Act, Job Corps, National Environmental Policy Act. Busy time changing what was happening. This decade also is a decade when I look out across this room, I just have you raise your hand if your career started in the 60s or the early 70s. This was our decade. It's the decade when we showed up. You can see a picture of me there in Alaska above Ed Cliff. You know, they're not on the same scale, but at that point in time, it was pretty important. I had some red rubber boots and a .375 Winchester Magnum. But it was a time where a huge number of transitions also were happening. And I'll call your attention to one slide, the slide up in the upper right. This is the dedication of Gray Towers in 1963 on September the 23rd. Think about that. 60 years ago, John F. Kennedy is doing that, and it's 2 months before he's assassinated. So let's look at that slide a little closer. There's Kennedy, there's Chief Cliff. They're dedicating Gray Towers. He has quite a bit to say. And I call your attention to this because every one of these slides that I've shown and will show, there's a story behind it. They're not just pictures, they're stories. So let's listen to what John F. Kennedy had to say there at Gray Towers for just a few minutes.
Hello, everybody. Rich Tim put me up to this, but I'm happy to be here. With the awakening of the conservation movement in the early 60s, President Kennedy, like so many other things he did, attempted to get in front of that movement. He and his staff considered what approach might be taken, and he decided to go to Gray Towers, Pennsylvania home of Gifford Pinchot, and present his speech. John Kennedy felt that the Forest Service was the ideal agency to lead the conservation movement through the next century. He believed that they had professionals in every field of resource management to oversee this mission. Unfortunately, he was killed a month later and his dream died. I was asked to speak with you today about this moment in history and to read an abbreviated edition of the speech that he made. It's profound and makes one wonder what would have happened within the agency had that dream been carried forward. John couldn't be here today to give the speech, so it's fallen to me. And this is what the president said. I begin today a journey to save America's natural heritage, a journey to preserve the past and protect the future. And there is no more fitting place to begin that journey than the home of America's foremost conservation family, the Pinchots. The most prominent member of the family, of course, was the oldest of James Pinchot's 3 children, Gifford, whose career was best summed up by his own statement on the 40th anniversary of the Forest Service he helped found. I've been a governor now and then, he said, but I've been a forester all the time, and shall be to my dying day. But Gifford Pinchot was more than a forester, more than the father of American conservation. He was a practical idealist, believing that the riches of the American continent should produce for all its people an abundant life, believing that the waste of our resources or their monopolistic control was an offense which threatened the very existence of democratic society. Pinchot's idealism was practical because it was disciplined. He viewed the American scene through the analytical eye of the trained scientist. His career, in fact, marked the beginning of a professional approach to the management of our nation's resources. Above all, he was a gifted, driving administrator, transforming a minor federal bureau into a dynamic, purposeful agent of national policy. But Pinchot's contribution will be lost if we honor him only in memory. For our industrial economy and urbanization are pressing against the limits of our most fundamental needs. Pure water to drink, fresh air to breathe, open space to enjoy, and abundant sources of energy to release man from menial toil. The American people are not by nature selfish and wasteful. They are not unappreciative of the heritage of the past and their obligation to the future. But without guidance and information, without leadership and inspiration, without the qualities provided by Pinchot in his day, which we can provide in our time, mistakes will be made, mistakes which can never be undone. Today, we often wonder how so many of our great forests could have been leveled with no thought to their restoration. Fortunately, there is evidence that this nation, once alerted, can take constructive actions, actions for which our grandchildren and their grandchildren will be even more grateful than we. The dispute is no longer one of principles or goals. It is now merely a question of pace and means. And no one maintains that the obligation to use our resources efficiently and thoughtfully depends solely on the federal government. Nor is conservation merely the job of the park ranger or the forest ranger or the soil conservationist or the game warden. Conservation is the job of us all. It is not always the other fellow who pollutes the stream. It is not always the other fellow who litters the highways. The careless conduct of a single individual in a forest can destroy in one day the product of centuries. But the role played by the federal government is a key one. Its attitude, effort, legislation, and example all influence the national pattern. The competition for the federal budget dollar is keen and properly so. But in the field of resources, opportunities delayed are frequently opportunities lost. And those that are not lost are certainly more costly to achieve. This nation is now rising to the challenge of exploring the vast universe of space. That is as it should be, for we cannot afford to ignore that challenge. But neither can we afford to neglect the universe here below. Gifford Pinchot once said, "A nation deprived of liberty may win it. A nation divided may reunite. But a nation whose natural resources are destroyed must inevitably pay the penalty of poverty, degradation, and decay. Conservation is the key to the future." Those words are more true today than when they were first uttered by the man whose memory we salute. Conversation is the key to the future, and I believe our future can be bright. If we can continue and expand the programs we've begun, if all of us at every level can meet our responsibilities, then we can write for our land a record of accomplishment and high purpose unparalleled in the history of the world. A record of saving and using this nation's supply of national resources to assure a fuller, richer life for all Americans now and for generations to come. Thank you.
Thanks, James. Well read. So we'll leave the 60s, move on to the 70s. We all remember the clear-cutting issue, Endangered Species Act, NFMA, RPA, roadless. Dennis LeMaster captured it well in A Decade of Change. There were significant issues there. Bitterroot, Monongahela, the Alaska Pipeline, Alaska Native Land Claims Settlement Act, clear cutting guidelines in 72, Frank Church guidelines. We had an oil crisis. Wrote this issue, wrote Rare 1, December of 71. How many remember working on those first maps in December of 71? Truman signed the Housing Act in 1949. There were 35,000 homes, 35 million homes in America. By 1970, there were 63 million homes. Population basically was doubling during that period of time. The 1980s, planning. Got to get the plan done. Got to follow the regulations and statutes. The below-cost timber sale. Amazing that in the short 30 or 40 years, we've gone from worrying about the timber sales aren't making enough money to the time when we don't care how much they cost, we're going to do them. It was also a time, the Yellowstone fires, Mount St. Helens, there was a group of folks got together, developed the vision statement and also the statement of caring for the land and serving people. There were a few folks involved in the pilot program. I'm looking at Butch Marita out there, and I can see him standing on the top of his desk telling people about how you gotta implement the pilot. The DG, Forest Level Implementation Planning System. Distributed Processing System, DPS. Forest Service is way ahead of the time. We had our own internet, and the world didn't have one yet. Dale Robertson put his heart and soul in transitioning the agency and came out with the initiative of Strength Through Diversity. Spotted owl was beginning to become the issue of the decade, and obviously the Exxon Valdez oil spill. The 1990s, Dale launched ecosystem management. Politics, change of administration, change of chiefs. Jack Ward Thomas became chief. South Canyon Fire, Northwest Forest Plan, Service First, some downsizing. We were carrying on a war over in Iraq. A lot of polarization, a lot of issues having to do with ROBUS. 2000 to 2009, 9/11, fire, beetles, climate, budget, Dale's 4 threats, but obviously that decade was dominated a lot by 9/11. And towards the end of the decade, the Hurricane Katrina. We also held celebration of the centennial. We had our own 100-year centennial Congress in Washington, D.C., and out of that, highlighted the film, The Greatest Good. 2010, 2019, restoration is the word. We started seeing different size fires, a lot of cultural transformation. There was a number of things that focused on that decade. A lot of it focused on changing our attitude towards the climate and understanding who we were. And that week was some of the highlights of that decade. And here we are, 2020, 12 decades since we started this journey as an agency. This decade is only 5 years around so far. We've got a pandemic, mega fires, climate, and significant political change and transition. I look at the 21 chiefs that we've had, and I've made the point a couple times that pretty much the first 50 years, which is almost 60 years, we had 7 chiefs, and in the last 50 years, we've had 13 or 14, or more than that, you can count them there. But the tenure of chiefs has become much less than it was back then. Before I move on to the next few slides, I just want to say there's a time when you look at that 120 years and you think about 21 presidents, 56 years of Democrat, 65 years of Republican, 29 secretaries, 24 chiefs, and we estimate, using our Ranger roll call from the museum, around 13,000 Rangers over that 120 years. And I submit to you that those 13,000 Rangers had the same passion for resource management and conservation that those 21 chiefs did. It's just a matter of where they were, where they could accomplish what they were all set to do. So, having looked at all that 121 years of history, and as a museum, we've been trying to figure out how to tell these stories and what is it that it's all about. And when you go to the building today, just envision that some of these stories are what we're trying to talk about. It's about mountains and forests. It's about protecting watersheds. It's about rangelands and grazing and ranching. It's about the history of wilderness in America. It's really about a history of providing for a growing nation. And it's about recreation in America, the full scope, depth, and broad capability of that, and how that's changed. It's about restoration and recovery. It's a story about science and research. It's history that's been shaped by crisis. And the exhibits, we will call that conservation for country. It's about World War I, about the Dust Bowl, about how we responded to emergencies and crisis of different kinds. It's a continuing story of wildfire in America, and it's a history of people working together, not only in the national forest system and state and private and research, partnerships woven through everything that we do and did during our careers as well. All those stories are mixed together, integrated, and that's the beauty of our agency and the multiple use themes that we've inherited. So, in closing my part, it's just a real story about people over 120 years who dedicated themselves to caring for land and serving people. And it's not just at the leadership level. It's people who are at every level of the organization, at the field level, at the front desk, on the fire line, at the lookout, wherever. And we all know that that's where the work actually gets done to accomplish everything that we've taken credit for or been done. So as I close, I just want to say the issues that really, in my mind, dominated how the agency has maintained its spirit is how we dealt with the fires of 1910, how we dealt with the world wars, whether it's one or two, or Vietnam, or the Korean War, or wherever. It's how we responded during the CCC days and able to work and inspire so many people who came through those programs. It's about how we responded to crisis like occurred in the 60s, the 90s, 2001, fires, and the pandemic. And perhaps one of the most challenging things for all of us over the years has been how we respond to that swing of pendulum every 4 to 8 years. It's a tough thing to do because it requires us to change. So with that, the question that I have posed to the panel, and they're all going to respond to this in different ways because they come from different thought patterns, is given those challenges that the agencies face, where does the strength of the Forest Service come that has allowed it to stay strong and focused on the mission of caring for the land and serving people? So I will turn it over to the panelists now, and we will first invite Donna Sinclair up to give her perspectives in her program. And I'll turn over here to get the rest of the slides.
Okay.
Don't worry about this.
There we go. Hello, everyone. I'm really honored to be here today. It's exciting to talk to the people who came into the agency in the 60s and 70s, in part because that's the time period that my research focused on. And I did start my study of the Forest Service. I'm not a Forest Service employee, never have been, didn't come from a Forest Service family, but I live in the Pacific Northwest and I love forests, and I started studying the national forests in the year 2000. So it's been 25 years of getting to know you. And I started by teaching classes that included students on public service courses at Portland State University, in which students interviewed former Forest Service workers from the 1920s through the 1960s. And then the Workforce Diversity Council came to Portland State and asked, could we do some interviews of people who were retiring, who had come into the agency in the 70s, the 60s and 70s. And so that completely changed the trajectory of the work that I was doing, because I ended up writing a dissertation that focused on the incorporation of non-traditional employees, women, people of color, and people with disabilities into the agency. So this is just a little snippet of how I see the agency. Am I doing it wrong? Oh, there we go, okay. As you all know, because you lived it, the Forest Service was built as a classic bureaucracy with a strong esprit de corps. Pinchot's unity is strength. That was a guiding line for the Forest Service. From the greatest good for the greatest number to caring for the land, serving people, the mottos reinforced that unity. For decades, leadership remained homogeneous, white, and male. So these images contrast that old order with the new realities brought about by the civil rights and environmental movements. But I want to start with a story. This is a story that shows how deeply American history runs through the agency. This is Paul Logan. Some of you may have seen him before. He was the first African-American forester in the Forest Service, and he was born at Tuskegee Institute, grandson of a Confederate veteran, and Mariah Cherokee Lily Hunt, a free woman of color in Georgia, son of Adela Hunt and Warren Logan, both of whom taught at Tuskegee with Booker T. Washington. So Adela is behind Booker T. Washington to your left. Paul's World War I draft card marked him as Negro, a label that barred him from Forest Service employment. He went to Cornell University, and then he began to work for the U.S. Forest Service on the Olympic National Forest in 1927. But to do that, he had to pass as white. He later became the forest supervisor. The Forest Service could not knowingly hire an African-American forester until the 1970s, nearly a half century after Paul's career began. And in 2005, when the Forest Service claimed him as the first Black forester, it was in the book, The Greatest Good. So, by 1980, women made up 28% of the workforce and minorities nearly 10%, up from just a handful in 1964. 348 women in the agency in 1964. So think about that for a moment. Oops. There we go. So this period marks what I call entwined diversification, when environmental and civil rights legislation converged. Environmental mandates brought the ologists, many of you, while civil rights laws opened the door to women and people of color. Often these were one and the same. The impacts of this time period included changing management practices, exposing inequities, loosening leadership restrictions, and bringing the agency into national debates. By 1978, the idea of a representative bureaucracy, a workforce reflective of the nation's diversity, was embedded in the mission. And this is something that people I talked to when we did interviews told me all the time. They talked about this, how important it was. In the late 1960s, the Forest Service began diversification efforts through multiple means, from Job Corps, which Tom mentioned, to direct hires. Rudy Edwards, I don't know if Rudy Edwards is here, and I may mention some people or may not mention people who should be mentioned today in this talk, by the way. But he recalled desegregating the Forest Service in Laurel, Mississippi after hearing about the Civil Rights Act. He was a young guy at the time, just I think getting out of high school. He wasn't welcomed at first, but he was determined to claim his place. And so he got a master's degree and became a soil scientist in Oregon, one of a growing number of Black professionals entering the agency, part of a cohort of Black soil scientists that included Arthur Bryant, Earl Ford, and Randy Moore. So we're going to hear about the Tuskegee story tomorrow, and it's quite a story. I want to encourage you to go to that session. One of its champions was Brian Hood. He's pictured on the bottom picture. He's the Caucasian guy in the bottom. He was a third-generation forester who saw the Tuskegee pre-forestry program as his contribution to the civil rights movement. In 2015, Brian discovered that his own Uncle Paul, his father's best friend, was the first African-American forester in the agency. Paul Logan never told Brian, even when he went to Tuskegee, that was the case. So that personal link between Tuskegee, civil rights, and Paul Logan shows just how entwined our histories really are, both inside and outside of the agency. Now, lasting change required more than breaking barriers, which Chip Cartwright did when he became a district ranger. I'm sure you've all heard of Chip Cartwright. It took building systems, and that work was led by Jetty Wilds, a Morehouse graduate who came to the Forest Service through teaching math and Job Corps. Wilds began by documenting racial inequities in pay and training, and then he developed a civil rights program in Portland, Oregon. That program's success led Chief John McGuire to bring him to Washington, D.C. in 1975 to establish the first national civil rights program for the Forest Service. Wilds later joined the SES and retired after 30 years. His program laid the groundwork for accountability and progress across the agency. And by 1978, the agency had hired thousands of people of color. Concerted efforts to diversify would continue strong into the 1990s. So there were multiple civil rights programs, both outside of the agency and within, and the Forest Service took advantage of them to strengthen and diversify its workforce. Those efforts extended the agency's long tradition of esprit de corps, broadening the sense of unity to include people who had long been excluded. In the late 1980s, Chief F. Dale Robertson and Secretary Richard Ling launched a plan to achieve civilian labor force parity by 1995. You all have heard this, I'm sure, Workforce 1995, right? They created partnerships with American Indian institutions and historically Black colleges and universities, and they formed special emphasis groups for African Americans, Hispanics, Asian and Pacific Islanders, and people with disabilities. Those programs built a new kind of esprit de corps, one that gave employees who didn't match the existing workforce a place and a voice in the agency. By the early 1990s, the the Forest Service expanded its civil rights work with workshops, training, and targeted hiring. And at that time, in Region 5, the Forest Service issued a report documenting discrimination against gay and lesbian employees. The service-wide Civil Rights Committee pointed out that sexual orientation was conspicuously absent from agency publications, including what they call the TMO report, or the Blue Book. And they warned that the silence suggested those employees were not valued. So you can see the book here. And it was pretty forward-looking. You can see that from the mission there. So Chief Robertson responded decisively, adopting multiple recommendations. He ordered a no harassment policy that added sexual orientation, marital status, veteran status, and political affiliation to protected categories. The Forest Service was a pathbreaker in the Department of Agriculture. I don't know how many of you know that, but it really was. By 1993, the USDA had followed suit. Robertson also authorized employee networks to make clear that inclusion was part of unity. In the 1990s, women were over 40% of the employee pool. Today, they make up about, 34%, and probably less at this point. Minorities about 1/5. These figures show progress, but they also show historic backsliding in terms of support for non-traditional employees and the distance that we still have to travel. So leadership has been slow to change, and I know not everybody is on here. There's a regional foresters, we're not included in this slide. But it has changed. So chiefs once came only from forestry ranks. Later leaders included wildlife biologists, that's why I put Chaplain Thomas on there, women, firefighter, and a soil scientist. Women and people of color began to take on deputy and associate chief roles, widening the circle of leadership. And slowly, the esprit de corps that once meant sameness had been reshaped to include difference. Now I'm coming back to Gloria. So some of you may be aware of the book Black Woman in Green. I helped Gloria to write this book. It's a memoir of her story. And I couldn't leave her out. She wasn't in here originally, but I couldn't leave her out because before she died, she asked me to share her story and to keep sharing her story because she loved the Forest Service. So for her and her family, the agency opened up opportunities that were once unthinkable. And Gloria's career shows how far the agency has come, how much farther it could go. Gloria loved the Forest Service with a passion that shows the esprit de corps that she maintained within the difference. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Donna. Appreciate it. And we'll take questions when we're all done. And we're going to actually let the panel take questions amongst themselves first, and then we'll take some questions from that. Next, we'll have James Skellen.
Well, thank you very much, Tom, for the invitation to be here. And also thank you for covering the entire history of the agency in 20 minutes. It's the second most impressive thing I've seen. Probably the most is my father was a political philosopher and was once asked to write a 1,500-word essay entitled Western Civilization in the World. He wrote that, and I never read it for that reason. My job's a little different in that I'm not talking so much about the Forest Service's resilience as much as thinking about some of the challenges that the agency has faced and is currently facing. And though it's always too early to claim historical significance of the present, well, I think there are some distinctives to the challenges today. And I'll tell you that my authority to address the Forest Service stems from the fact that I did my graduate work at Cornell University, which, despite what they all say about Yale, had the first professional school of forestry. Yeah, it was started in 1898, 2 full years before Yale. And if you're not familiar with the university's illustrious forest program, it's because it lasted for 5 years. Bernard Furneaux was asked to lead it. The state gave him 30,000 acres in the Adirondacks as an experimental forest. a good European silviculturalist, he went to the Adirondacks and he found these slow-growing, useless hardwood species. So he began to clear cut them and replace it all with Norway spruce and white pine. And his only mistake is that this land was adjacent to many of the grape camps of the Rockefellers, the Gettys. They'd never seen anything so ugly as these clear cuts, and then the smoke from his slash fires was blowing into their homes all day. So they cut the funding to the school, they took away the forest, which is now in forever wild category, and when New York State finally had a new school of forestry, Cornell later had a department, its only stipulation was that it couldn't be at Cornell. And so that's why it's at Syracuse. And I'm obligated as an alumnus to be bitter about this. So time asks us to talk about resilience in the agency, but resilience from what exactly? Some of the challenges that the agency has faced, that you all face, are inherent in a multiple use mandate, particularly when the meaning of that mandate expanded so dramatically over the last 120 years in response to changing science, shifting Western economies, the explosion of environmental laws in the 1970s, let's say diversified staff, as Donna talked about, and certainly changing public demands. The agency, the resilience here is obvious. In fact, I think for many of you, you understood that the challenge of that was part of what you signed up for. So Chief McArdle, who said in 1953 that, quote, "I believe that our inability to satisfy completely each and every group of national forest users is a definite sign of success in doing a job assigned to us. When each group is somewhat dissatisfied, it is a sign that no one group is getting more than its fair share." After I read that, I've adopted that as my motto in teaching. I assume that if all of my students are angry, I'm doing something right. And given the breadth of multiple-use management, the agency's always felt the pendulum swing from administration to administration, as each new president pushes the multiple-use balance in a new direction. And the current administration is doing the same, at least rhetorically. We always have to wait and see what the actual outcomes are, but rhetorically calling for increased timber production, oil production, natural gas production, etc. So this is familiar terrain. But the broader context in which the agency is currently wrestling with these priorities is more than just an argument about how we balance management priorities. The broader context, if I look at our particular moment, really is about a challenge to the administrative state and the idea of professional agency management at all. The first Trump administration came in 2017 promising to dismantle the administrative state. So again, the goal is not simply to promote the timber program or the wildlife program or wilderness protection. At the moment, I would say, and I invite argument, that the goal is to limit or undermine the capacity of many federal agencies to do the job assigned to them. And I want to make that argument, or sort of how did we get here, because I have 10 minutes. Tom made the mistake of saying I could take a little longer. That was dangerous. But 10 minutes by just looking at, I'm just calling public land rebellions. And looking at 3 so-called sagebrush rebellions. There's a continuity here, focused challenge on the way the federal government manages land and also on its authority to own land. But then also I want to highlight a real shift from the first to the last. In most basic terms, what we see, and you all worked through these periods, what we see is the Sagebrush Rebellion, 79 to 82, as essentially a regional challenge to federal authority brought by Westerners, both Democrats and Republicans, who had a material interest in the land. And it was waged through state legislatures. The present challenge is something quite different. Even though it's focused on federal lands, which are predominantly in the West, it is now, I think, a national rebellion against certain aspects of government authority per se. So, my extensive slide deck, I give you a few pictures here. So the Sagebrush Rebellion, 1979 to 1982, erupted over the growing impact of environmental laws and their administration, or their implementation by the Carter administration. And this was particularly the impacts on public lands managed by BLM, rather than the National Forest System. National Environmental Policy Act required new environmental review. As Donna mentioned, it required open participation in decision-making for all Americans. The Wilderness Act led to the conflicts that you remember over review of roadless areas, led to extensive litigation. Endangered Species Act was impacting public land management substantially, thinking particularly in the Greater Yellowstone ecosystem. And of course, the National Forest Management Act, the Federal Land Policy and Management Act were reiterating and emphasizing anew the importance of balancing environmental protection, you might say, with resource development. Basically, changes in the law and an administration that was using this to push a particular balance threatened key power relationships, particularly in the American West. So the rebellion, and the Sagebrush Rebels, by the way, adopted this language. President Reagan identified himself as a Sagebrush Rebel. And it emerged then as, I already mentioned, a regional battle. It was very specific to public lands of the West. There were Democrats and Republicans in state legislatures who were pushing for state ownership over federal lands. And the tools of it were largely the tools of lobbying, state legislation, debates in Congress, etc. It's also significant, though I won't say more about it, that it was waged at a time of print media and network nightly news. That really is quite significant. The war for the West, which a phrase isn't as widely used, but this is sort of, I don't know, a redo of the Sagebrush Rebellion. This is a period that actually started, somewhat surprisingly maybe, during a Republican administration of George H.W. Bush. Though Bush was antagonistic to regulatory policy, but Bush was also leading in areas like talking about, a new world order. He was talking about no net loss of wetlands. And in the middle of his administration, a new movement, resistance, emerged. I would say that what triggered it was probably the way in which the agencies, Forest Service in particular, were adopting an ecosystem or ecological-oriented approach to management. And the way in which judicial decisions, particularly on the Endangered Species Act, were pushing agencies in a different direction. In this period, there was frustration growing out of the West by people with material interests in the land. But this period found all kinds of additional new support from conservative infrastructure around the country. So this time, instead of state legislatures, we have this movement tied more to things like the county supremacy movement. We have it tied to private property rights movement. And the push here was to shift power and authority from federal agencies to counties and private property owners. And I would say that it does make a difference that this took place in the age of 24-hour news channels and the dawn of the internet, which helped forge, made mobilization quite a bit easier. I would also say that in this case, we see the birth of what has become much more pronounced, which is direct action, sometimes dangerous or threatening action, against the federal agencies. So whether that's county commissioners using bulldozers, whether that is threats directly or actually violence against federal employees, or this is a period where we see the rise of militias engaging in debates over public lands. These are the militias that in the 60s and 70s were squarely rooted in the white supremacy movement, but we're now rebranding as patriots in defense of the Constitution. And some of that type of, I would say, sort of rhetorically violent patriotism gained mainstream position. So militia leaders were testifying before Congress, sharing a variety of conspiracy theories, and given a legitimacy in place. What I'll call the Patriot Rebellion, the third, exploded really right after President Obama was inaugurated, and really was sparked probably by, specifically by passage of the Affordable Care Act. And rather than starting as a regional rebellion focused on federal lands, this was a national rebellion rejecting federal authority, which in the West focused on federal lands because they're the most visible symbol or sign of that federal authority. And in this rebellion, I would say militias and others with an insurrectionist impulse played a far more central role, largely with the blessing of certain media outlets, certain sitting politicians, and the Patriot Rebellion took place in the age of social media, which both democratizes facts and mobilizes action at breathtaking speeds. Perhaps the best phrase to describe this rebellion's underlying ideology is constitutional anti-governmentalism. So I want to pause for a minute and think about that. Constitutional anti-governmentalism. This is the era in which groups like the constitutional sheriffs and everyday patriots assert that they are the final arbiters of the meaning of the Constitution, and they assert that over and against congressional statutes, judicial decisions, and executive action. I currently live in Michigan, and I believe it was 2020 when a group called the Wolverine Watchmen had a plot to kidnap our governor over COVID restrictions. And the county sheriff, one county south of me, when interviewed, said that, well, this probably would have been a legitimate citizen's arrest because the governor was violating our constitutional rights. And then just listen to the divergent narratives about January 6th. We're still debating as a country whether that was an insurrection that violated every standard of law and order or a peaceful and patriotic protest against election fraud. And that brings me to the current administration and its pledge to dismantle the administrative state. I was asked to speak last spring on the administration's environmental policy, and the best I could do was to say I wasn't sure what the environmental policy was. On the one hand, it does emphasize some traditional Republican priorities of resource development. But the primary policy does seem to be an attack, or I would say at least the policies themselves have the impact of undermining a great deal of capacity by federal agencies to do their job. In the first administration of President Trump, the BLM took the brunt of this. That was seen maybe most clearly in the agency moving its headquarters from Washington, D.C. to Grand Junction, Colorado, which has no nonstop flights to D.C., and the subsequent loss of 80% to 85% of all their Washington staff. But in the second Trump administration, we're seeing this play out across government. The Forest Service, as we heard earlier this morning, lost, I think Chief Schultz says 5,300 staff have left the agency through both direct layoffs and incentivized retirements. The Park Service, which rarely gets the brunt of this, lost over half of its seasonal hires for the summer. So my point here is not so much to beat up on the Trump administration. I don't do that professionally. I occasionally do that privately. But it's to say that what we're looking at here is something slightly different. I don't mean this apocalyptically. I'm not catastrophizing. But we are seeing something different than the usual shift from, more resource production to less resource production. or more regulation to less regulation. We are seeing a questioning of the legitimacy, the purpose, and the value of having federal land agencies. And that's a great distance from 1963, when the agency, the Forest Service in particular, was held in the highest regard as the model federal agency, as the way administration should be done. I'll leave it to Rachel to talk about where the resilience comes in. What I would say is that even though the moment is different, resilience comes from the same things. It comes from employees of the agency doing what the law requires and quietly engaging with partners and the public in the things that matter most to them, which are particular places, particular forests and rivers, particular species. And in that, giving some evidence, continued evidence, to the value of the public lands themselves and to the rich history of and value of the national forests. The other thing I would say is that the resilience comes from groups like this and those in the agency who tell again and again its story. And I don't mean the story that historians would tell. I mean, my job is a kind of critical empathy. My job is to sort of try to tell a critical story from multiple perspectives. But the story, to tell it again and again, of an agency that first brought you in, what first motivated you, and what inspires you to get up in the morning and keep doing that job. So, thank you very much, and Rachel will now explain how that all works.
No pressure. Let's see. Well, good afternoon. I'm so delighted to be with you all this week, and thanks to Tom for putting this together, and to Jamie and Donna for their insights. Like Tom mentioned, I'm a second-generation employee who, over the last 16 years, has had the privilege of working on more than 70 national forests and grasslands in every region, not to mention historic highlights like Gray Towers, the Cradle, and the Forest Products Laboratory. My slides. Here we go. As a historic preservation specialist, I've evaluated everything from Forest Service administrative buildings and campgrounds to mercury mines and hundreds of outhouses. Throughout my work across the agency, though, I've never stopped being in awe of the landscapes and resources we protect, or the people who protect them. Your passion, your stories, your persistence, it's what makes the Forest Service more than an agency. And that's what I believe gives the agency her strength, our mission carried out by the people. While Donna and Jamie shared some great history, for the next few minutes, I'd like to offer some of my own reflections on the founding of that mission, its change over time, and some of the people that I have studied who have carried it through. So where does this shared mission come from? We all know Pinchot's initial contributions. We've talked a lot about that today. But the roots go deeper into the 19th century. In 1850, Susan Fenimore Cooper warned in Rural Hours that careless farming and logging practices threaten species, climate, and communities. A decade later, George Perkins Marsh argued in Man and Nature that deforestation and poor land use had destroyed past civilizations and could destroy ours. By the 1870s, people were openly warning of a coming timber king. By the end of the 19th century, numerous voices had recognized the need for sustainability and that the nation's beautiful landscapes could not be treated as endless. They required stewardship, choices made not only for the present, but for future generations. By the 1890s, the questions were clear. What do we do? How do we do it? And who does it? Should forests be preserved as untouched, as John Muir urged? Or managed for sustainable use, as conservationists argued? Progressives believe the answer lay in scientific management and federal regulation. Gifford Pinchot carried those debates into national policy, defending conservation as the greatest good for the greatest number in the long run. At the 1907 Public Lands Convention in Denver, he was met with vehement opposition. But his calm defense of science and stewardship helped turn hostility into acceptance, laying the foundation for not only professional forestry, but more importantly, a shared value in public lands. This mission was never easy, and it was often tested by competing demands, politics, and public resistance. Yet from there, the Forest Service became the home for foresters and rangers, turning science into practice on the ground, and carrying forward the idea that forests and natural resources should be used wisely, not only for the benefit of today, but also for tomorrow. And if you've ever visited Gray Towers, you may have seen the twin copper beech trees that Pinchot planted. He never was able to sit in their shade, but his grandchildren would. And to me, that captures the essence of conservation, making choices not just for ourselves, but for those who would come after us. So while Pinchot made the saying the greatest good his own, a maxim originally derived from Jeremy Bentham, women in the Forest Service also claimed the idea of conservation and gave it their own nuanced meaning, calling it a conservation cause. They subscribed to efficient scientific management, but added to it a moral dimension, tying conservation to American culture, citizenship, and the welfare of future generations. For them, forestry was not just about lumber or carpentry for future use, but also sustaining relationships between people and land. Women carried out this work in many ways, as clerks, librarians, statisticians, map makers, lookouts, scientists, and educators. Long before smoking, they pioneered conservation education and fire prevention programs, like Edith Mosier, who is the founder of conservation education in the agency in 1907. She illustrated tree species and wrote lessons for school children, teaching that learning conservation early helped make children better future citizens. Margaret March Mount, known as the Children's Forester, directed women's forestry programs in the 1940s and inspired schools and women's clubs to plant millions of trees throughout the Penny Pines program. Behind the scenes, female clerks like Julia Shin built the agency's information filing systems, tracking permits, grazing allotments, timber sales, and creating maps. Their accuracy and order provided the backbone of professional forestry, ensuring that the work of foresters and rangers in the field was supported and preserved. Together, men and women carried the conservation cause through the first half of the 20th century, each shaping it in their own way and ensuring that the Forest Service mission rested not only on science and efficiency, but also on values of community and civic duty. But they didn't do it alone, and they didn't do it as individuals. They did it as families. Rangers, their wives, and their children carried the conservation cause into daily life at remote ranger stations. Living in 1 or 2 bedroom cabins that doubled as offices, wives answered phones, maintained ledgers, cooked for crews, cleared trails, entertained visitors, usually without pay or without recognition. Dorothy Guck, one of these wives, described it best. Rangers, those conservation preachers, are as devoted to their life's work as any religious minister is to teaching the gospel. A ranger's wife believes and spreads the conservation gospel of her husband. For her and many others, the daily labor of dispatching fires, keeping books, and tending stock was part of a larger calling, conserving timber, water, wildlife, and values for those future generations. Through the 1930s and through the 1960s, fire dispatching became one of the most critical roles. During this time, wives were also building community across the agency, hosting potlucks, supporting families throughout constant moves, and developing what we've come to call a Forest Service family. My grandmother, Patty White, was one of those community builders and dispatchers. My grandfather, Wayne, worked on the Lincoln National Forest in the 1960s as a fire crew chief for the Mescalero Apache, while my grandmother ran a ski lodge and hosted Friday fish fries for the crews. My mother remembers it as a big family, parades with Smokey Bear, evenings of shared meals, and even a ring one crew member made for my grandfather that I still wear today. I also grew up playing on the Roosevelt National Forest and spinning in my grandfather's chair at the Rocky Mountain Research Station in Fort Collins. He worked 30 years for the agency, and my grandmother supported him every step of the way. The Forest Service was truly my family affair. By the middle of the 20th century, the Forest Service faced a turning point. The conservation ideals forged in the progressive era could no longer remain static. They were being tested by growing demands, rising criticism, and a society that expected more from its public lands. In 1960, Herbert Kaufman published The Forest Ranger, a study in administrative behavior. His book described the ranger as the center of the agency's culture, loyal, disciplined, and uniform. But as he was writing at that very moment, that culture was about to be transformed. That same year, what came out? The Multiple Use Sustain Yield Act, which expanded the mission beyond timber, grazing, and water to include recreation, wildlife, and wilderness. The unified, homogeneous model Kaufman celebrated was already under pressure to evolve. Through the 1960s, the agency sought to reassure the public of its relevance. One way was through popular culture. The Lassie TV series portrayed the ranger as a steady, approachable, and trustworthy public figure. The show was, in effect, a public relations effort at a time when the Forest Service's credibility was faltering under the weight of conflicting demands and rising environmental critiques. By the 1970s, the Forest Service had to confront head-on the environmental, social, and political pressures expanding its mission. Landmark laws like the Wilderness Act, NEPA, the Endangered Species Act, the Clean Water Act, dramatically reshaped what it meant to manage national forests. Single resource management gave way to ecosystem thinking, and the workforce diversified beyond foresters and engineers to include specialists of all kinds, biologists, biologists, hydrologists, archaeologists, and even historians. In adapting, the agency found its strength again, its people. Specialists brought new expertise in managing entire ecosystems, and women and people of color began stepping into leadership roles. The Forest Service endured not by clinging to Kaufman's model, but by evolving, by opening the work of conservation to new perspectives, new disciplines, and new voices. And through it all, the work was still carried out as a family, rooted in the same shared mission that has guided the agency since its beginning. So things weren't always easy or happy in the Forest Service. Like so many of you, I saw the hard parts too. The political fights, the shifting administrations, the projects that were silenced or erased, the harassment and inequities that weighed on too many of us. But in the midst of all that, I also saw what carried the agency through: its people, its families, and its deep commitment to the conservation cause. For me, this story has always been personal. Over 16 years, the agency became more than a job. It was my community, and the colleagues that I worked with became my family. Together, we built programs, wrestled with tough histories, and carried the conservation cause forward in our own way. Following after my grandfather, I thought I'd be buried in my Forest Service uniform that never quite fit well. But I had to throw that down. But as a single mom of 3, and with the changes in administration that scrubbed my work from websites and censored what I could share, I realized I needed, like Pinchot, to break new ground for myself. And so, like the Forest Service itself, I've had to adapt. My time in green has ended for now, and I've stepped into a new chapter. But still, my commitment remains. It just looks different now. I continue to believe in the power of people, in the strength of stories, and in the mission of conservation, not as something fixed in one uniform, but as a legacy we all carry forward. And that is a lesson I've learned from this agency that I love, and one that will continue to see the agency through. Thanks.
Well, we've got time. We talked about maybe if any of you had questions for each other, we would do that first. Is there an interest in doing that, or are you comfortable with where we're at and opening up for questions? Okay. We'll open it up for some questions if you have any. We've got a couple extra mics, and I'd like to recruit one or two people. Raise your hand if you have a question, and we'll get a mic to this. Any questions? I got this one.
You don't get the mic, just your voice.
Thanks, Jim. This is a question for, a good one for historians, and so I'll put it open to the panel. You know, we've seen in the Forest Service a number of different eras, and historians are good at naming those eras. We had early on the custodial era, and then we had post-World War II, probably a production or commodity production era. We had the multiple use era. We moved into ecosystem management in the past 20 or so years. What would you say is the era that we're heading into? I mean, I like this constitutional anti-governmentalism, but what's in a short synopsis? Where are we headed?
No answer.
Yeah, I think, all right, so professional historians don't include me in their guild, so I can cheat. But, you know, when you take the oath of a historian, we promise never to predict things. But again, I'll cheat. No, well, I really don't know. I mean, part of it is part of the nature of the 90s and the early 2000s around biodiversity, ecosystem management, adaptive ecosystem management, was about trying to integrate or connect more disciplines over broader landscapes. And the language between Republicans and Democrats varied. I mean, it was the Clinton administration emphasized ecosystem management, but Lynn Scarlett in Interior would always talk about large landscape conservation. It was this recognition that there needs to be something broader and more holistic. What I see now is, I don't mean within the agency employees, but a wholesale rejection of that. And so I don't know if in the future we might call this something completely different than what I'm thinking. But I mean, this seems to me to be more a period of fragmentation. And I think that that's also what I was saying about the first Trump administration and the movement of BLM's headquarters. You know, I'm not close enough to make a lot of comments on the intentions or motivations, but I think we're seeing dissolving regional offices as, you know, partly how do we devolve and fragment. And so I just say that as a point of real concern.
I would just say that it is an era of dismantling, particularly the dismantling of the administrative state, which is really echoing what you're saying. And in terms of predictions, I think that depends on all of us. What are we going to do to prevent that from happening?
There's so much, we don't have time to really answer that question. I think though, what Jamie had shared with the pendulum swinging, right? We can see that throughout history, where we're moving from one side, we really dig in, and then we move back to the other side of whatever the opposite was previously, right? And so I think through that fragmentation, there is a very much attack, if you will, on the capacity of people. Before I left in April, we were being asked to do so much more than we ever had previously been with fewer people. So I think this will be very much a test in the resolve of our people and how we're going to handle that fragmentation.
I'll just add something that builds on that. the talk that I gave was about diversification, right? And so you have both the environment and society really engaging in that overlapping diversification, diversity of thought, all of those things that we talk about. And it feels like this is a sort of re-homogenization. And that's why I say we can actually do things to stop that by simply, in part simply, nothing simple, but really echoing the value of that diversity of thought, the value, that the environment and society echo one another. And I think the more that we talk about the benefits of that, the better.
A hand over here.
Right here. In the final days of the Clinton War administration, they imposed a rota school on us and everyone else. And I just would like to know what the status of that is right now. I've heard rumors and good rumors that it may soon be eliminated.
I don't know the status for sure, but I have heard the same rumors, like it's being dismantled. That is the idea. They wanted to add it.
Oh, here we go.
Rachel, you said that at the end of your career, your scientific data was removed. Were you able to keep that at all? Archive it someplace?
What was removed? I didn't hear fully your question.
Your data, that you said that your stuff was being erased.
Oh, I was able to speak with some of the folks at Communication, and a lot of what had to be taken off of the website was archived in deep, dark places. And so I am hopeful that one day the Women's History website that I created last year will again see the light of day. And so, but in the meantime, I'm still working and writing a monograph on women in the Forest Service. I completed a dissertation on the topic, looking at women from 19th century up through the 1960s, and I'm completing that book focusing on you all, on women currently, who 60s through the present, and that should be published if I can find some time to finish it in the next year or two. But a lot of those things that I had created, that my staff created, were gone, were censored. I was working with the chief's office prior to all of this for the Linked Service Awards, and we were creating a list of milestones for each year in 1994, 1999, 2004, so on. And a lot of the things that I was providing, the such and such, the first woman of Hispanic heritage to be a regional, whatever it was. Well, we can't say that. Okay, well, the 1999 roadless rule, we can't talk about that. Okay, what can we talk about? So a lot of those things we just couldn't even talk about in discourse in the Linked Service Awards. But I'm hopeful that those things that were shut down will sometime be brought back.
I have to add something to that, because by the end of January or beginning of February, I like to track the diversity numbers in the Forest Service, and I have been for the last 10 years. And I went to the OPM website, and all diversity data is gone. So there's disability data and gender are still listed from 2024, but that's it. So there is no diversity data, and I just have to say that I'm very aware when it comes to the federal government and who was let go, a higher proportion of the people who were let go were women and people of color. So my numbers no longer stand up. That 34% is probably lower.
Thank you all for your presentations this afternoon. I have a question that relates to the people that we serve. We have about 360 million people that are further and further
removed from understanding the role of resources in their lives. 2x4s come from Home Depot. Water comes out of your tap. How do we connect with that group to help them understand the importance of the lands that we manage and the organizational structure that it's going to take to manage those lands? Any ideas?
I love this question, and I think we can reach to history to provide the answer. Women paved the way in this area through their conservation education programs. The General Federation of Women's Clubs, which I would love to see a revitalization of these types of things, garden clubs, the Daughters of American Revolution, they're still out there, but we need to have them really stand up and provide more programming. These women were in front of classrooms, radio programs, they were, I'm sure had television been on, they would have been in front of the TV screen. Margaret March Mount, her daily schedule makes me dizzy. She was on radio programs speaking to people, dinner, luncheons, all kinds of things packed into a day to talk to people about conservation and all of these principles. And the way that these women were able to be so successful is that they connected these scientific processes, say like erosion, planting trees, cutting down trees, burning trees, to something that was very personal. Edith Mosher wrote a really beautiful poem that I didn't have time to share with you, but the sentiment was, if I plant those trees, my family planted those trees, and then I see them burning, that means a lot more to me, because those are something that I cared about, that I planted. And so that's where we see women tying the idea of conservation to this cause of moral and civic duty. And I think if we can get people out in front of, with whatever means we have on social media, but really getting in front of people and explaining these things and connecting them in a relevant and accessible way, like these women did previously, we can really recapture a lot of that effort.
Yeah, thanks. Great question. And I would say there's a certain irony here because outdoor recreation numbers on all public lands are at record highs. So you kind of wonder, how is it that we have so many millions of Americans on public lands, and yet what you described is still the case? I'll say that there are two pieces in my mind. One is how the agencies approach this, and that is that internal tension we heard about this morning between basically how do you censor, or really how do you control the message that the agency is sending out, when really what needs to happen is that the people who are on the ground in communities that care about specific places, those people on the ground need to be in the schools talking freely about the health of the land. And so that tension between the needs of the bureaucracy and administration of controlling the message is, I'm not saying that that's in all cases wrong, but that's a fundamental opposition to what really needs to happen, which is free conversation on the ground. And I would say that the Forest Service, probably the Park Service does this the best, but the Forest Service does real well. I see Jim Ellis here, Jim Caswell is here. BLM, how about this? BLM struggles the most, in part because the agency just doesn't tell their story very well, or much at all. But the other piece of this that the agencies don't control is the degree to which Forest Service, or forest rangers, Forest Service employees are respected or not respected by the public. So if we go back to 1963, if we go back to Kaufman's book, The Forest Ranger, I mean, you were wearing the green uniform, you had a certain status in the community. And this would have been true, I can think of other professions. So priests were among the most trusted members of society, police officers most trusted. There are a number of professions where you simply don't enjoy that same assumed trust and authority that you used to. If I sound sensitive and defensive, it's because I'm a college professor. And likewise, we don't enjoy the same just sort of deference that we used to. And then the final thing I'll say is, as someone who I direct to ecosystem preserves for my university, is that's a job that partners are going to need to do reaching kids a lot younger. And so a lot of the work that we do at our interpretive centers is catching pre-K kids through high school students and trying to do some of that education so that when they do go to a national forest camping with their family, it's not just sitting around the fire, but they have some eyes to see sort of the complexity and the value of the landscapes around them.
Can I add something a little controversial here? It might get some boos, but I think Smokey Bear has made us lazy. Prior to the advent of Smokey, it was these women's clubs, it was the women's program of forestry and the Forest Services. It was out in front of all of these different communities. It was the rangers out in front of these communities. And since the advent of Smokey has replaced those positions essentially in conservation education, and it's become, it's a nice tagline, it's a nice poster, but it really reduced the amount of people who are out in front of the community. And so I think that's the challenge, is that we take Smokey with us, obviously, but we don't just put the burden on Smokey to communicate these things.
Speaking of being a college professor, one of the things that I wanted to say about this is that through our students, that's part of it. I mean, when I'm teaching U.S. history, whatever I'm teaching, sustainability, U.S. history, women's history, the public lands belong to all of us, and that's one of the key lessons that I try to transmit. But also the youth programs, in terms of the age of dismantling, we have Job Corps that is undergoing some attacks. The YCC has gone from being a program that was residential to one that is no longer residential. And I know there are people in this audience who came into their profession via those residential programs. So advocating for solid education is really important. And then finally, on a happier note, when it comes to what we learn in the academic world or in the professional world, it takes a long time to seep into K-12 schools. Right now, they're still teaching conservation. They haven't stopped. It's kind of semi-regional, but the environmental movement is still there. Teachers are trained in these things. And then there's also tribal partnerships. Those are gaining strength, watershed management and so forth, the tribes. So there's hope.
Any more questions? Yes? I'll hold the mic if you have your voice.
Hi, I'm Joe Golden from Powhatan, Virginia, Central Virginia, where I live. The Civil War is still alive, and so I'm a little fearful. So I wanted to ask you a question, and been touched on the role of media in the changing and in rebellion, and from our beginnings with Thomas Paine, media was important. So I wonder if our historians could comment a little bit on what is the current media that we use, and how is it affecting the division in our country today?
Rachel says that's a whole other session. However, I kind of keep up with these things because I have had teenagers in my house and also was on a school board, so have experienced some of the backlash there. Our media what's happening with our media right now is that it's becoming more and more divided and more centralized. It's important to recognize that. And I'll just say, I think it's important to speak out when there is any opportunity to prevent a repression of the media.
Yeah, it's a great question. President Clinton was asked once what changed in Washington in his experience from when he first went as a congressional staffer in the 60s at some point to when he left the White House. And he said one of the most significant dynamics that he saw change in Congress was that when he started, when Congress was in session, he claimed, members of Congress were in DC doing the business of Congress. By the time he left, I should say they were doing that because though transportation technology hadn't changed that much in the time, they weren't moving back and forth as quickly. And the communication technology was different, and the way people received news was different. And what that meant is that members of Congress in DC, when some issue blew up, they didn't have to respond in 30 seconds. They had a day or two, before it kind of got out. He said by the time he left is when he saw the perpetual campaign. So that members of Congress were increasingly challenged to sort of just be focused on the business of their job. And I think that is sort of a little window into the dynamics of how much more reactive, I'm thinking just people in government, how much more reactive people have to be. So when there's a crisis, the response has to be in 15 seconds. That means there isn't time to talk broadly with a bunch of people. And so we're making faster decisions. And then the issue of just the way in which the algorithms feed us what we want to hear means, it really is challenging to find people with whom you disagree fundamentally and have a context in which you can have an easy conversation. And so what I think that the social media and the speed of communication are doing is they're helping reinforce kind of coalitions, particularly coalitions of grievance, that are powering our politics. If I could go just a little bit longer at this, when we talked, Don and I both sort of talked about this period in 1960s, 70s, and Donna, you mentioned the significance of the civil rights movement. When I look at the conservative or Republican coalition that Reagan really cemented, and Reagan said in his first inaugural address, government is not the solution to our problems, government is the problem. The coalition that he put together really were people who were frustrated by the growth of the executive branch. So it was manufacturing in the Northeast, frustrated by OSHA and new workplace laws. If we go to the Southeast, real concern both about school integration, but also about school prayer. Abortion in the West, it was much more about public lands. And so what Reagan had to kind of move around the country, or other politicians, to kind of assemble this coalition to say, hey, we might not all have the same grievances, but we're pretty sure government's the problem. And then, by the way, I seem to be picking only on the right. That's only because the administration that's in. I could talk about the left too. But now, with social media, it's sort of this constant reinforcing of coalitions, and particularly coalitions of grievance. And those are really hard to penetrate. And they're also really hard to escape, the ones that I'm in. So, but thanks for the question.
You're not getting the mic.
So my question is kind of really selfish, but I think I'm not the only one with this problem in this room. And that, first of all, I'm a second generation retiree. And I have all that amass of history, and nobody wants it. And I have called the Ranger District, that my father was a district owner, for example, and I called, the forest. Anyway, places that I thought would want some really relevant stuff of history, we don't have any place to store it, was the first answer I got. And the second one is, we don't have anybody that looks at that or cares about it. And I find that really interesting because it's history from the 50s and 60s in the West, when we really started building roads and having big fires and all that, What are your tips for how do we convince, people coming up now that might be relevant to their management?
I love this question. Chief Moore and I were working on this right before the administration changed. We were looking at creating a centralized repository of archives. Intellectually, our collections are really distributed throughout the country. Honestly, I have a lot in my garage. I don't know where to put it either. People just, hey Rachel, can I have your address? Yes, because I just don't want it to get thrown away. And so there are different repositories that you can work with. I can't speak for the museum, but I think the museum would definitely be a place to call and consider what materials you have. The Forest History Society, which is located in Durham, North Carolina, will be more than happy to help you take those things, digitize them, and get them out in front of the public. One of the reasons that we have such a, I think, a diminished profile of the Forest Service and sort of the respect and the things that we were talking about is that a lot of our records have gone up in smoke, literally, or they've been thrown in dumpsters. My grandfather dumpster dived. I have a lot of his stuff that he saved. When I was at the National Archives in College Park just in June, the Forest Service collection stops at 1942. There's nothing except a few boxes when it comes to the late mid 20th century. And so if you've got things, please share, send me an email. I will help you. I don't care. Just don't send it to me. I will help you get it to an appropriate place, because that definitely needs preserved so that we can continue to tell these stories and historicize all the things that you have lived through.
Call 406-541-6375 and ask to speak to Dave Stack. Rachel, the story you just shared is exactly why our organization was founded.
Well, I want to, one more question.
I realize this might be speculation, but I'm curious if the panelists could speak to whether they think a videotape of today's presentation could be hosted on a government website at this point.
It's for the laugh.
Well, they asked for me to do the history of the world, and I thought I'd do that in the next 20 minutes. No, I have one additional slide before we dismiss and thank this wonderful panel. And if I can, Cornelia Pinchot in 1949, when they were dedicating the Gifford Pinchot National Forest, had some words, and she talked about Gifford. He insisted that conservation must be invigorated, revived, remanned, revitalized by each successive generation. Its implications, its urgencies, its logistics translated in terms of the present by each of them. The victories and achievements of conservation must never be regarded as an excuse for complacency, but only as an incentive to further goals. I think that fits pretty well with a lot of what our feelings are today. I want to thank this panel. Thank you so much for all of it.